New York's redistricting process continues as new maps are released. Here from an expert on the next steps in a process that some argue is doomed to fail. Hi everybody, welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Now that process surrounding New York's district lines continues with yet another set of maps being released for public comment now. New York's Independent Redistricting Commission releasing its newest maps earlier this month. The lines in yellow are where the current assembly lines stand. The blue lines you will see are the latest from the Redistricting Committee. The redraw is now subject to 12 public hearings, with the final maps due in January. One expert says the state needs an entirely new process to go about this.
At this point, we should not be entertaining any activity by the commission or the legislature in drawing any maps. It should be in the hands of a master, and this process should end once and for all.
And we're joined now by Jeffrey Weiss, professor of law and senior fellow at the New York Census and Redistricting Institute at New York Law School. We're talking about the latest release from New York's Independent Redistricting Commission. Jeffrey, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us once again. Nice to see you.
Hey, great to be with you.
So let's talk about this now. The maps, the assembly maps were good for just this midterm election. Now that that's over, they went back. The Independent Commission has now put forward what they say is good to go. However, still not the final version, correct? Because we're going to have a public comment period moving forward here.
Right. Well, we are still a ways off from having a final assembly map to be used in 2024 elections. What happened recently was the release of a preliminary map agreed upon by the members of the state commission, both the Democrats and Republicans. But that map is now going to be subject to a series of at least a dozen public hearings that start in mid-January and go through early March. And after that time, the commission could be expected to reflect on the public comment and revise the map some more before it's submitted to the legislature. And it has until April 28th to do so.
Now, some of the concerns that were out there initially with the maps before this latest iteration here, and I know Blair Horner, who's executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, had expressed some concern with the older maps that the districts contain similar numbers of people as far as their size range. And this latest round that has just been released, at least he feels a little bit better about what he's seeing there.
Well, what happened in the map that voters used for last month's elections, we had a situation of all of the 150 assembly districts being rather low in deviation, where the difference in the size of the largest to the smallest district, there were very small difference. The plan that was released by the commission last week goes closer to the 10% maximum limit from the size of the largest to smallest district. And it's important, though, because in previous decades, many of the upstate districts were overpopulated and the downstate districts were underpopulated. Now, pretty much most of the districts statewide, from Buffalo to Montauk Point, are equally populous.
One of the other concerns I'm reading here from Susan Lerner, who heads up Common Cause New York, she's more concerned again with the process here. And I want to read, she says, quote, "The Constitution, as in the state constitution, requires at this stage, the map drawing should be conducted by a special master, period. The court, in sending the assembly maps to the Redistricting Commission, stepped outside of the required constitutional provisions." Does she have a point there?
Well, her point is well taken, and it's one that, in her view, the commission only had until earlier this year, until February or March to finalize its product. And then after that time, it can no longer develop plans for the legislature. As we know, the commission itself imploded. It failed to agree on a second round map to submit to the legislature back in February. And because the state constitution gave the commission until February 28th to finalize its work, then anything after that point in time, could not happen. So the view now that Susan Lerner is advocating is for the court to draw the plan and not to give the commission and the legislature a second chance.
So anybody that's really looking to challenge this here, is that good footing for them as far as any sort of lawsuit goes?
Well, there is a lawsuit that's pending,
Okay.
an appeal to the court order that put the commission back in business.
Mhm.
That appeal is pending in a state court in Manhattan. The appeal will likely be heard in January. And despite the fact that the commission is proceeding to schedule hearings and put out a map, that could be reversed by the appellate division. And of course, that decision, an appeals decision, could then be appealed one step higher to the State Court of Appeals, which by January or February should have a new chief judge, which makes a major difference here.
And that will be right around the time when these public hearings are supposed to get underway anyways. From what I understand, you said mid-January. I believe January 9th is the first date for
Right.
those hearings.
Yeah, the first hearing kicks off in, I think, Buffalo
Mhm.
on January 9th and ends up, I think, in Queens County or Suffolk County by March 1st.
And how do those hearings look for those out there and that may want to take part in it? What does that process look like?
Well, at the hearings, the public has the chance of testifying either in public or via Zoom. And from the hearings the commission held earlier this year, a great number of people came out to speak out on the map. So we could expect a lot of people lining up to let the commission know what their views are on the draft map.
And as far as you're concerned, how do you feel? And I know we've talked about this before, and as far as this commission being completely independent, which really remains to be seen depending on who you talk to, what is your feeling, Ben, about this whole process?
Well, we're going through a process into another year that was designed more or less to fail and not to get us to the point where we have an agreed to plan from the commission and the legislature. It's interesting to note that the commission did agree, the Democrats and Republicans, on one plan 2 weeks ago. So we have to see how much farther this cooperation goes, and then what the legislature does with the map once it's before the Assembly and Senate, and whether, if there's an agreed upon map for the first time by sometime next year, whether the legislature will accept it or revise it.
And that whole idea that this thing was really set up to fail, can you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Well, the amendment that the voters approved in 2014 was created in an effort by former Governor Andrew Cuomo and the Senate Republicans who were controlling the Senate back in 2012. And it was basically an effort to create the illusion of an independent process so that Governor Cuomo can get his wish of having an independent process in turn for letting the legislature draw its lines by itself the last time 10 years ago. The Republicans 10 years ago held the majority in the state Senate and thought that with the then independent Democratic conference, they'd always hold on to a majority. No one ever thought the Democrats would take over 2/3 in both chambers in the Assembly and the Senate. And no one ever thought, once that happened, that the courts would then prevent the legislature from acting, which is just what happened back in the spring.
Jeffrey Weiss from New York Law School. We appreciate your insight as always, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Immigrants arriving in New York by bus from the southern U.S. face a complicated legal situation once they are here, often without any support. But new funding from the state hopefully will see them getting that free legal support. We're going to speak with an immigration advocate about what this will mean for that developing situation down in New York City. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Immigrants arriving in New York City from those southern border states will now be getting additional support, hopefully getting them the legal services they need. 3 new grant programs will now look to provide $3 million over 3 years. The funding is coming in the form of grants to the State Office for New Americans, which will give that money to community-based organizations to provide the free legal service those immigrants need. The newly arrived migrants will gain support for several legal issues, including those facing deportation or detention. All right, joining us now to talk more about the impact this funding will have, we have Murad Awauda. He's the Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Of course. So before we get into the newest funding just announced by Governor Hochul recently, let's talk about the crisis and where it stands right now. The last time we spoke, buses upon buses of these immigrants from southern border states were coming into New York City. Where does that stand now? Are you seeing fewer buses, and what are the numbers of people we're looking at right now?
Approximately almost 30,000 people have arrived in New York City from the southern border who were bused by Texas Governor Abbott to New York City. We are seeing, at the height of it, we were seeing 6 to 14 buses a day. And now we're seeing about 1 to 3 buses every other day. So the numbers have drastically reduced, which makes it a little bit easier on actually being able to intake individuals into the system so that they're able to get into the shelters and then start navigating their way to receive services.
And let's talk about the shelters, because I know at first it was a real mode for the city to kind of scramble to find these people a place to stay. They had built the tent structure, one that was a little too close to the water. There was worries about some flooding. They moved it to Randall's Island, and that facility has now closed, correct?
Yeah, so the Randall's Island HERC facility, which the New York Immigration Coalition was against, did close a couple of weeks ago and closed only a few weeks into being open. This was one of the most Herculean efforts I think the city has done under this administration, where they were able to expand emergency shelter, and open up 80 new shelter facilities within a few months, which is an amazing feat. We were against the tent because we didn't think that we should be housing folks in a flood zone inside of a tent where we are, at the time, we were in hurricane season and we're seeing a lot of rain. And at the initial site where they wanted to do this, there was flooding, even with the tent there. So we were happy that they shut down the Orchard Beach facility. And then when they moved it to Randall's Island, we were disheartened, but we're happy to see them close that facility and really move people into brick and mortar safe facilities.
A lot of these immigrants are coming in from what I understand, Venezuela. What kind of services, and especially I'm getting at the folks who speak the language and are helping them guide them through the next steps here. How has that been working out?
Services were at capacity before COVID. During COVID, they got even worse because of the pandemic. We are working, as you know, the New York Immigration Coalition is a coalition of over 200 organizations across the state of New York. And we're working with our members to try to figure out how best to serve this new population that's coming in with limited capacity and with limited resources. So we've been doing the best that we can, and we're trying to make sure that everyone who has arrived in New York has the ability to navigate city services, but also get the supports that they need, including immigration legal assistance, to understand better what their legal journey is going to look like. I think that many folks assume that the immigration process is very clear cut, and it is not. It's one of the most arcane systems that we have in the United States. And people who do not have support throughout the system, throughout the process, are going to get lost in the system.
Well, that's just it. And they're coming here. They don't know why they're coming here. They were given essentially no direction when they were put on these buses. They're just expected to come here and they think things are going to happen for them. They don't speak the language. So let's talk about this recent announcement from the governor, $3 million worth that's going towards that legal aid. What exactly is that money going to be put towards, and how is it going to benefit these people?
So we were excited to hear Governor Hochul announce the $3 million in legal services funding. It's a little bit short of the ask that we made of her, which was $10 million, which was part of our Welcoming New York platform that we launched immediately after the first buses started to come to New York. But we're excited to see that the governor is investing in providing a lifeline to these individuals to make sure that they're able to really navigate the legal system and the challenges that are going to be ahead of them. The money is going to be used for legal services. And, you know, the announcement that came last week was really well received across the state, which just shows the governor's leadership in supporting immigrant communities, as we've seen in the past.
You know, Mayor Adams has come out and said at the rate they're going, housing people, feeding them, educating children that are coming through, this is an effort that's going to cost, he estimates, the city upwards of $600 billion a year at the current rate. For those that are watching, Murad, and they want to help, how can they go about helping, whether it be donating clothing or donating money? What should they know?
Well, I think to the mayor's point, this is going to cost some money. And earlier this past year, the Biden administration announced their emergency shelter and food program through FEMA, which would provide individuals who, like the ones who are in New York City, with some support. That funding is what the city should be going after. And I know that they have applied for it and they're waiting to get reimbursed. And making sure that folks have the basics, right? Somewhere to put their head at night to sleep, and then some food in their stomachs. But also we have to go further than that. We have to really make sure that we're setting people up for success as opposed to failure. And I think for people who are interested in donating, clothing, there's a number of different institutions that are collecting clothes right now. We're collecting resources and accepting donations to continue to support the work that we've been doing. Since August, we've helped tens of thousands of our newest New Yorkers come into the city and provided them with clothes, with food, but also we've coordinated services. Just this past weekend, we had an amazing event in torrential rain, and we had almost 200 people waiting online before the event started to get into the event. So, you know, there's folks can visit our website, www.nyic.org, and then just toggle around to the donation page.
Awesome. And I believe I misspoke. I believe I said billion. It's upwards of 600 million they're expecting it to cost. Not quite as much as I said there at the beginning. Murad Awada, Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition. We appreciate the time. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Governor Kathy Hochul is set to start her first elected term as the governor of New York. Head the new year. A new poll is checking in on what New Yorkers think about the governor so far. We're going to have those approval numbers for you. Hey, welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. After winning the election, Governor Kathy Hochul is now only a few weeks away from the start of her first full elected term as the governor of New York. She took the role over 15 months ago after Governor Andrew Cuomo resigned. Capitol correspondent Jamie DeLine tells us how New Yorkers feel about the job she's doing and what they're hoping she will accomplish in the new year.
Ahead of the new legislative session in Governor Hochul's first elected term in office, Siena pollster Steve Greenberg explains what voters think of her in the latest Siena poll.
Right now, 45% of voters have a favorable view of Kathy Hochul. 43% view her unfavorably. That 43 is the highest it's ever been. 45 is not great. It's not terrible. She's above water, barely, but it's not great.
So why the disconnect?
It may be the circumstances by which she became governor and how little voters knew her before she became governor. Maybe that makes her climb a little harder, a little higher, but it's still out there for her to do.
Back in January, Hochul's goals for the state included revitalizing SUNY, making communities safer, and increasing trust in government.
When we ask voters, how do you think Kathy Hochul did? How did the Hochul administration do in living up to their goal to try to make communities safer, as she laid out in her 2022 State of the State address back in January? voters say she's failed.
When it comes to the new year, the top 2 issues voters would like to see her tackle are the cost of living and crime. Crime was a big campaign issue for her opponent, Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin, whose favorability has seen an increase after losing the election by 6 points in November. A total of 816 registered New York voters took part in the poll. And when it comes to Hochul's goals for 2023, we'll find out more about them in her State of the State address on January 10th. In Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
Thank you, Jamie. And do stick around. We'll be back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. All right, and finally from us here on Empire State Weekly, as the year draws to a close, some of you may be considering making a health-conscious New Year's resolution. According to a 2020 study from the National Library of Medicine, roughly half of all Americans make a resolution each year. More than half of them fail, with many people ditching their new habit just a month or 2 into the new year. As this year wraps up, we're going to speak with a cognitive science expert from New York College on what people are doing wrong when it comes to making those resolutions. Hopefully, we can straighten everybody out. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. We'll see you right back here next week. And remember, you can catch us all over the state of New York. Here's a full schedule of where you can see Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across the state.